Welcome to Generous Theology. Chuck and Brock take a break from reading material today and talk about their own personal experiences in Christian life.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. You mentioned that these don't have to be opposite. The opposite of harsh doesn't necessarily mean weak and wimpy. I was thinking about this in relationship to a sermon that I preached a while back. The earliest Christians in the Roman Empire, before they had any kind of power, nobody would ever accuse them of being soft, being wimpy. They were going to their death in front of lions and standing up for their beliefs. And so there's no way that they were soft. But the way that the church, one of the ways that the church really grew, and I know that there's even recently the British historian Tom Holland, who is not Christian, has pointed this out, that much of the growth of the Christian church came because these people who were treated like nothing, who were fed to the lions, killed, behaved in a way that was so winsome. And for example, when there were epidemics, as there often were, and pandemics, as there often were in the Roman era, in those days, what people would do is the wealthy people, they'd just leave, right? The Roman leaders, the emperor and all his folks, the landowners, they'd just take off. They'd leave the city and they'd go out to the countryside where there weren't people around, and they'd just do their thing. And, well, the people who are left, too bad for them. But the Christians would stay, right? Now, many of them stayed. Maybe they didn't necessarily have a choice, at least some of them, but there were others who did, but they would stay and they cared for the sick. And really the first sort of hospitals and things began form out of kind of care that Christians would give, caring for the sick, sometimes just providing basic, hey, here's some food, here's some drink, here's a place to lay your head. We're going to just take care of you. And people would get better. And interestingly, because a lot of the Christians were exposed to some of the germs of those eras, they would start to build up immunity. And certainly many of them died as well. But they built up some immunities that these guys who would just escape never got. And they were able to do this work even better. Similarly, in the same way, another area the Christians were involved in is this was in the days before abortion was even technologically possible, but the Roman equivalent was basically to leave babies who were unwanted exposed, put them outside the city walls and let the animals get at them, or if the animals don't get them, eventually the elements would. And many times during the Roman times, these people who would be left out there were babies were girls. Males were much more valued in the time. And the Christians said, no, we're going to turn this upside down. We believe that everybody has value, male or female, slave or free, Greek or Jewish or Roman or whatever. They've all got value. And so what would happen is the Christians would go out and they'd see these babies and they'd bring them inside the walls. And despite the fact that many of these Christians had very little to themselves, they would take care of these kids and raise them as their own. And of course, as we talked a little bit before about the idea of a covenant theology and God working through families, that's what happened here. And suddenly you had all these children, many of them girls, who would grow up to be women, who would grow up to be the caregivers for others, who were Christian as a result of having been rescued. And the Christian church grew. Now, I think there's a sense in which maybe because we're moving away from Christendom, where Christianity has power, to something a little bit more akin to, not quite in a way as the Roman Empire, but where at least Christianity doesn't have the same sort of power that it maybe did 100, 200, 500 years ago. There's a sense in which now we've got to think of ourselves as Christians, and whether it's in the areas that we're talking about, caring for others, for the sick, caring for the unborn or the unwanted, or whether it's even in our discussion of these kinds of issues and why we as Christians, I think the pro-life movement is exactly one example. I don't know that we always do such a good job of explaining why it is this is such an important idea to us, right? It's not about trying to control people's bodies. It's not about trying to have men rule over women. It is about caring for the human individual that has that God-given image in them. And I think there's a sense that if we can be more generous in our theological and our philosophical discourses and explaining why it is that we come to certain conclusions in a winsome way, I think we can we're not here to win the day, we're not here to conquer the world, but we are here to win souls and to win communities, right? And I think we can do that in the way that we do our academic pursuit, in the way we do our more philosophical and theological pursuits as well. And so that's another reason why I'm just so excited about this idea of generous theology of Bavinck, how that sort of impacts all these other areas where we can lend others.
So true. So beautifully said. I think one other thing, Chuck, I'm going to ask for our session here tonight. And I know we talked about the Dutch Reformed, maybe because there's so many options in that group, I'm actually going to maybe ask you to exclude those. And can you talk about maybe some of the most influential theologians outside of that group who have made a difference for you personally, theologically, doctrinally, if we could throw that out there? Some of the giants of the faith who have enriched you and made you wealthy beyond all measure in these beautiful and wonderful and glorious truths.
Yeah, moving outside of Reformed, and specifically Dutch Reformed theology and theologians and thinkers, some of them are people that are just really super well known, people like Martin Luther. I just love a lot of the things that Martin Luther has to say about what it is to have a vocation. And there's a lot of good Lutheran discussion on vocation and what it means to live in the world. And honestly, I am amazed how often I read things that are like, wow, I really like that. And I find out it's Pope John Paul or it's Pope Benedict Ratzinger before he became Pope, or even the Rerum Novarum. Remember which Pope that was off the top of my head, but from around the turn of the 20th century. I think there was, honestly, I think there was a lot of unspoken, unacknowledged back and forth between Catholic theologians and Reformed theologians at that time, but neither side was sort of perhaps willing to grant to the other that they were listening to them. But it is amazing to me how much, as I read issues, especially related to politiconomics, that learning from people like that. Another Catholic, I don't know if he counts as a theologian, but he's a thinker, is G.K. Chesterton. There's not everything that he said do I necessarily agree with, but there's a lot that Chesterton wrote has had an impact on how I think about it. But then I would add one other group of people, and these are people that nobody else really knows their names. In many cases, I don't even remember all their names. Just what Abraham Kuyper in the Dutch Reformed tradition would have called the little people who, just through the way that they were as Christians, the way that they cared about each other, and just had an impact on my life. Frankly, my own grandmother, although she eventually did become part of that tradition, certainly is a big part of that. She perhaps more than any other individual person, talked about the things and lived her life in a way that really me and the rest of my family in the direction that we ended up going. Nobody would call Betty June Adams a theologian. Nobody would call her a philosopher. She only died a few years ago. But yeah, she had an impact on me that outsizes even 90s to live.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm so glad you mentioned her, because even as we talk about Bavinck and Kuyper, Berkouwer and Hoekema, Warfield, Gordon Clark, Cornelius Van Til, Calvin and Luther, so many wonderful names. It is still the last mile, the person who shakes your hand, who imparts so much of the gospel message. There's a saying in education that I think applies in theology. Some things are better caught than taught, and better felt than telt. And I love that little saying. I actually can say that's been true for me. There have been certain people who have been that way to me. Like you say, Chuck, the little people, or the last mile, the people who meet you where you are and who interact with you and who shake your hand, and that divine spark passes to you. There's a verse, Romans 1:17. Some translations will talk about the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Now, some translations will say the righteousness of God comes by faith from start to finish, or from first to last. But in the Old King James, it has this from faith to faith concept with it. And I think this is more sentiment than dogmatic, but one of the things that came to me when I was reading and thinking about that verse, I don't know, maybe you had these, Chuck, as well, the Christmas Eve service where everybody would go just after sunset on Christmas Eve, and we'd have a worship service. And of course, it was a candlelight service. So everybody would get a candle, and we would start in one spot and with one candle that represented the light of Christ coming into this world and dispelling the darkness. And of course, that light would light others' candles, and then the others would light the candles of their neighbors, and it would progress on through to light all of the candles of all of the people in the worship service. And it was a beautiful thing. Though, of course, there were always church elders, it seems, who were nervous, who were afraid that maybe perhaps open flames in the church sanctuary were a bad idea. But having said that, this idea from faith to faith, as wonderful as Calvin was and Bavinck and these other quote unquote greats, it's the last mile. It's the person who lit your candle, who made that difference in your life and made that difference in my life. And I will say that there are several, Chuck, and most of them at this point in time, most of them are in heaven. I was a young boy, and most of them were older and more mature, even back in the 1980s and 90s. And most of them are with the Lord now. But having said that, they're not world famous, but they made all the difference to me. And the Lord used them to get to me. And that was such a wonderful thing. I talked earlier about the antithesis of being simultaneously simple and yet sophisticated. So I may study Bavinck and Kuyper and Calvin and Luther to be sophisticated and capable and scholarly and intellectual. But at the same point in time, it wasn't those ivory tower things that necessarily transmitted that divine spark to me that I received when these beautiful saints just were in my life and loved me and lived the faith in front of me. I sang in a church choir in a Southern Baptist church in the early 2000s, and I was almost the only male in that church, and I was in my 30s, and I was the only person under, I think, 60. So this was an older church, and those older ladies just adopted me as if I were their own grandson. And it was wonderful. And I made so many wonderful relationships with them. And none of them were world-class theologians. There was a shining light of a theologian just down the street at one of the Ivy League institutions. And these women were not that person. And God, in his goodness and in his kindness and in his providence, used those beautiful ladies and us singing together and making music and making merry and making melody in our hearts for the Lord. Used that as such an instrument of from faith to faith, as Romans 1:17 says, that I'm overjoyed thinking about it now. At this stage, I have a dear friend who is still involved in that church. I've moved away from that area many years ago, and I have a friend who's still in that church. And recently I checked in with that friend, and I found out that practically almost all, I should say, of those beautiful older ladies are with the Lord now. And so they're not here. And I'm rejoicing because I know where they are. They're in glory. They are singing praises to God in such a beautiful way that it's beyond my comprehension. And I know that it will one day be my portion to be reunited with them in cleanness and wholesomeness and in God's beautiful way. And you don't have to be a theologian to make that difference to somebody. And that is really striking to me, that we have such a God.
Yeah, amen. I love to think of the idea that you and I and my grandma and some of those old ladies from that Baptist church of yours, and maybe Herman Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper, will all sing together in choir, and we'll sing praises to God. It's a beautiful idea, and it's something we can look forward to.
My friend, this was beautiful. I really enjoyed talking with you and getting personal. We typically to just deal with the material more than the personal side of it. So thank you for the detour, but we'll wrap it up here for this session. And I just want to say thank you and blessings of the Lord with you for the rest of your week.
Thank you as well, and blessings to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your week, and forward to talking again